The former Prime Minister Scott Morrison has been advocating in a rare appearance in Congress for tighter alliances to counter the rising threat from China. He did not mince his words. In contrast, the Albanese government is trying to balance the trading relationship with China while respecting America as our principal security partner. Joining me live now is a former Home Affairs Secretary, Mike Pezzullo. Mike, thanks so much for your time. There's been a bit that's happened this week, so let's take some time to go through it. First of all, Andrew Clennell, our political editor, spoke with the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, about some of these issues. We like to read between the lines with these things, but what was your take on that?
Good morning, Laura. I think the Foreign Minister laid out in the interview with your political editor on this network, Andrew Clennell, the basic three-part foreign policy that we've been pursuing, certainly for the life of this government, and I would argue probably for some years. There's a trade track with China, and you saw that in its full glory, if you will, with the six-day trip. There's a security, and interestingly, Foreign Minister Wong also spoke about the investment relationship with the US. We often talk about the trading relationship with China, but we've also got to remember there's a very significant economic and investment relationship with the US. So let's call that track 2, so the US track. And then she talked about a track where we can exercise more autonomy and a bit more independence with other countries in ASEAN, with India, with Korea and Japan. That's really the three-part track. I think the government's approach is to take a calculated risk that two of those tracks won't collide. So you can keep trading with China, you can gain prosperity, lots of jobs are dependent on that trade, and you can keep your security relationship with the Americans going, and we're building infrastructure. We've got Talisman Sabre, and there's other things that you and I have spoken about in recent weeks. And as long as those two tracks don't collide, I think there is balance in our policy approach. Now, if I can just very, very briefly focus on the China track, I think there's frankly some hysteria about the China track. In some of the commentary, sometimes indeed commentary on this network and others, it's almost like the government has no cognizance of the hard-edged reality that they have to have about China, and it's almost like a pantomime villain with children screaming, saying, "Look, look, look! He's behind you! He's behind you!" in those old day pantomimes. The government is very clear-eyed, I think, and Minister Wong said as much when she recently called out China's military expansion. I think Mr. Morrison's intervention, which is a really important intervention, is to remind us that they use tactics such as flattery, engagement, drawing you into their orbit to peel you off from the American orbit in a very calculated way. And as long as we're clear-eyed about that, and Mr. Morrison had made some judgments about that in his testimony, I think maintaining that balance is fine. The problem is, Laura, as we've often talked about, it's fine until it's not. If those two tracks collide, and we can talk about how they might collide, that's where the problem emerges.
Well, how do they collide? Because, I mean, it's more than a calculated risk. We can't have those two tracks collide. We need to maintain both.
I think they collide in one of two ways. They collide, and you're seeing this played out through the AUKUS review, where on the American track they say, look, it's all fine because we've got our own trading relationship with China. I mean, the President just authorised the high-end chips from NVIDIA to be exported to China. So it's not as though they're not seeking prosperity from their trading relationship with China as well. But what the Americans are also pressing, and you see this from the comments from the Pentagon, is that if that doesn't work and it comes to a clash, we need to have done the preparatory work, the collective security work, the contingency planning, what you and I have talked about before in terms of the war planning, to get ready for, if you like, Plan B. So at that point, even that discussion, and you saw that with Mr. Miles, who was interviewed on another network last night, having to dance around, and I don't say that pejoratively because it is a tough area to talk about contingencies that are hypothetical. That's one of the ways in which the tracks potentially collide, is if that planning and that preparation for collective defence in anticipation of a conflict gets to the point where it irritates China or it draws a negative response. That's one way in which the tracks can collide. And the other way, obviously, is if there's a preparatory phase in a crisis leading to a potential conflict, which is, I think, in the realm of a 10 to 20% chance over the next few years.
Well, Morrison was interesting when he addressed Congress, wasn't he? Because he's unshackled by the need to be overly diplomatic because he's no longer the Prime Minister, so he can drop a few truth bombs where he needs to be. But he was particularly pointed when it came to China's risk. How helpful is this to the Labor government? Of course, America will be sitting up and taking notice of that. So what did you think about that testimony?
Well, I think from the government's perspective, your question is about the government's perspective. I suspect they probably find it unhelpful because that balancing act that the Foreign Minister talks about, or laid out actually very well on your network, relies on dialing down some of that critical talk about China. And so to have a former Prime Minister come along a couple of days later on the Wednesday in Washington, which played out on the Thursday morning here in Australia, I don't think the government would see that as being particularly helpful. It doesn't take away, though, from the merit of what Mr Morrison was saying, which I think the government behind closed doors fully accepts and recognises. Things like, one truth bomb was, China uses flattery and trying to sort of inveigle themselves back into a relationship to peel you off from an American orbit. China uses that very deliberately in a very instrumental and targeted way. I think that's something that the public should be informed about. Now, it doesn't help the government's way of managing the narrative, but I think it is a truth. And I think the government behind closed doors fully recognises that.
Yeah, I think so too. Perhaps it does help when it comes to reminding America how important Australia is strategically, geographically, and perhaps that comes back to AUKUS and this review and where it all ends up. Now, Richard Marles has got, he's got to walk this tightrope as well. But when it comes to our capability and who determines it, of course, as a sovereign nation, we would do that. Let's go back to what we think Eldridge Colby and the Pentagon, the White House and Trump himself, what are they trying to engineer as an outcome here?
Well, as you and I have discussed on several occasions, we don't really know where the President is on this. It's certainly something that appears to be driven by the US Defence Department, and they're just doing their job. I do think that references, and you'll hear it again, I suspect, today in the context of AUKMIN, which is our bilateral engagement with the UK, and we can perhaps come to that in a moment. I think you'll hear again references to the American review being routine and all the rest of it. I don't agree with that at all. I think it's a very targeted, very deliberate review. It might well be routine in the sense that we're a relatively new administration, we're looking at everything. But I think it's got a particular point, and it's the point you and I have talked about before. I think they're concerned about submarine availability, and we've talked about whether you ramp up production and or ramp up maintenance and try to solve the mathematical problem of the availability of boats through one of those means. But I think, frankly, Laura, it is also about contingency planning and accepting that no Australian government can bind a successor government, but at least saying, well, if Plan A doesn't work and we have to go to Plan B, because remember, and Mr Marles said this again last night, we're seeking to deter conflict. Well, the main way in which you deter conflict is to convince the other party that if it comes to a fight, you will prevail. And so the American question then is, if it does come to a fight, and let's call that Plan B, in the absence of Plan A having worked, what are your roles, responsibilities, capabilities? What jobs would you do in that joint fight versus what jobs would we do? So we can start to think about how we get our assets lined up and positioned. And we've talked before, for instance, about the submarines that are going into Perth. What role would they have in any kind of conflict in the Indo-Pacific region? I think that discussion, in at least in the Pentagon, possibly the White House, we don't really know what the President's view is. That's probably just as important as solving the mathematical issue around the availability of boats.
Plan for the worst. Yeah, plan for the worst, hope for the best. So what is really the big risk here? What is the worst in terms of our contingency planning? What should we be considering?
I think we just have to take President Xi at his word. He's determined, and a lot of this comes through in the Chinese language press that then gets translated and gets put onto specialised strategic newsletters. But he's made it very clear. The reunification of, as he sees it, of Taiwan back into China so that Taiwan's governed from Beijing is his number one strategic priority. It is a hangover from what he considers to be the century of humiliation, when China was humiliated by imperial powers, and Taiwan, one way or another, is coming back. and it's going to either be achieved by a series of strategies and tactics, either political subversion to the point where they just simply voluntarily want to do it, probably not going to work, some kind of quarantine where they start checking for goods on ships, possibly a blockade to cut them off from the rest of the world. But in the end, to really achieve political sovereignty, you've got to put boots on the ground, and that means an invasion. That is the worst case. I don't think it necessarily leads to a war, because the key question then, Laura, is will America fight? Now, if America doesn't fight and Taiwan is reclaimed through an invasion, well, the possibility of a Pacific War is actually very low, not good for the Taiwanese, but a broader Pacific War is then avoided. And that's where it's really difficult to judge these probability and possibilities unless you've actually got a deep, intimate engagement happening with President Trump and his most senior advisors about what's your current thinking about whether this is something that you would stand for. That's actually the most important question in Australian foreign and strategic policy at the moment, is what would the Americans do? Not because we're going to follow them blindly, we'll make our own choices, but that is the big variable. We know what President Xi is likely to do. What we need to know is what is President Trump and his administration likely to do.
Wouldn't we all like to know? Mike, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much.